Russia is trying to deal with heavy losses, ignoring or realizing how much the war in Ukraine has damaged its army and its allies. In fact, the Ukrainians have been conducting an incredible offensive operation for about 3 weeks in order to make the Russians aware of this. These offensive operations of the Ukrainians are proceeding from 3 different directions. First, offensive axis Zaporizhia. Fierce clashes are still going on here. Ukrainian forces finally liberated Hain in this region. Thus, the number of settlements cleared of Russians in Zaporizhia increased to 8. The second offensive axis of the Ukrainian army is the Crimean Peninsula. The latest 9 drone attacks have occurred here. The target of the drone attacks in Crimea was the important port city of Sevastopol. The third and final axis of attack within the great offensive plans of the Ukrainians is the Donbass front line. What happened here is reminiscent of trench clashes in World War II. Russia's biggest mistake is its tactical strategy in this region. You know that Vladimir Putin received support from 2 different military sources, especially in Donbass, excluding his own army. One of them is the mercenaries of the Wagner Group, and the other is the soldiers of the Chechen leader, Ramzan Kadyrov. After this decision of Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin, who announced that he would withdraw his forces from Bakhmut to the central front lines of the city, Chechen soldiers began to be much more active on the battlefield for Russia. Kadyrov continued to send his soldiers to their deaths one by one. For Putin, Chechen soldiers fighting for the Russian army had once again created an intense military convoy. Traffic on the line stretching from Mariupol to Donetsk. In recent days, there have been indications that the pro-Russian Chechen presence has increased, especially in Donetsk. Adam Sultanovich Delimkhanov, named Kadyrov's brother, was among those who went to the Donetsk front line. We are familiar with that. Kadyrov sent his relatives to the Ukrainian front lines, but it was a big risk for Adam Sultanovich Delimkhanov to go to the Donetsk region, one of the most active front lines, because it was known that Delimkhanov was a field commander in Mariupol. This area is currently under Russian control. In addition, Mariupol is a front line with much fewer clashes than Donetsk. Russian telegram channels reported that Delimkhanov and his entourage were inspecting the front line for possible use by Kremlin forces before a dam in this area was hit and awaiting the arrival of a senior Russian general. But just at this moment, the sound of a HIMARS rocket train around Delimkhanov. The Chechens, the Russian soldiers and officials in the investigation, Team Duma member and longtime Kadyrov's brother-in-law, Adam Sultanovich Delimkhanov, was hit by a long-range HIMARS artillery while leading a delegation visiting a prison in the Russian-controlled area of Ukraine's Donbass region. The stunning HIMARS attack succeeded in destroying 200 of Delimkhanov's soldiers. However, Delimkhanov, whom Kadyrov saw as his brother, managed to survive this attack with injuries. Politicaria Group, a partisan group opposing the pro-Putin regime currently at the head of the Chechnya region, also confirmed that a Kadyrov unit of 200 soldiers was destroyed in a HIMARS attack on the day of the HIMARS missile attack. Some news sources first claimed that Adam Sultanovich Delimkhanov was dead. Thereupon, Ramzan Kadyrov asked the Ukrainian intelligence to provide information on exactly where and in which positions the attack took place. Kadyrov also announced that he will offer a generous reward to anyone who finds his brother-in-law, Delimkhanov. Hours after the attack, when the news began to come that Delimkhanov was still alive, Ramzan Kadyrov shared another message, repeating his demands. The Chechen leader still continued to ask the Ukrainian intelligence for help in finding Delimkhanov. Kadyrov's cries for help were this loud. For the first time since the beginning of the war, many pro-Russian information platforms have criticized Delimkhanov, his bodyguard, and local security officials for being sloppy and underestimating the ability of the Ukrainian armed forces to detect a stationary convoy in the open and then strike it with a long-range attack. In fact, the Russians also had security deficiencies in this regard because it's claimed that Dlimkinov examined a region in Donetsk for the Russians. In other words, Vladimir Putin and the Russian officials responsible for the war could not even take the safety of Dlimkinov, one of their ally, Kadyrov's most valuable assets. But Russians like to constantly deny and put the blame on someone else to make up for their own shortcomings. In a Telegram post, Russian Lieutenant Colonel Roman Vnuvitin accused Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the mercenary Wagner Group, of leaking targeted information about Dlimkinov plans and vehicle column. Vnuvitin claimed that Prigozhin leaked information about the convoy's travel route and passengers to Kiev as a personal attack on Kadyrov. Kadyrov and Prigozhin, both leaders of thousands of armed men who are not tied to the Russian military's chain of command, have long been rivals in favor of Russian President Vladimir Putin. From this point of view, it seems likely that Prigozhin will attempt such an action. But according to some claims, Putin is aware of everything, and that's why the Russian leader wants to gradually neutralize both the Wagner Group and the Chechnya Command one by one. According to some analysts, Putin is considering using the private armies of Prigozhin and Kadyrov as insurance against a possible coup led by the Russian army. But for Putin to use two different military forces, both teams must not have officials who rebelled or refused to die. When this is the case, first of all, Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin's reputation is destroyed by using the Russian Ministry of Defense. Finally, Dlimkinov, who is seen as Kadyrov's brother, is tried to be excluded from the war. The claims that Russia's behind these actions do not sound unreasonable. Well, if Putin is following such a strategy, is Chechen leader Kadyrov aware of this? Following Putin's order that all members of the armed volunteer group sign contracts with the government by July 1st, Kadyrov delivered his formal agreement in a widely publicized ceremony to allow members of his personal paramilitary group to sign individual contracts with the Kremlin. Judging by this decision of Kadyrov, the Chechen leader doesn't seem to care if his troops are destroyed on Ukrainian soil, because although the number of casualties of pro-Russian Chechen soldiers increases, Kadyrov's war policies seem to remain the same. But Prigozhin informed his mercenaries that he would not order them to sign contracts with Russia. After this decision, there were alleged fears that the Wagner leader would succumb to the Ukrainian fighters. If we examine the war strategies followed by the Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov and Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin, we can see that this idea makes sense. Prigozhin's decisions are much more logical than Kadyrov's, because the Wagner leader thinks that the big offensive plans of the Ukrainians in Zaporizhia, Donbass and Crimea will be much more successful in the coming days. And Prigozhin even congratulated Kiev after the Ukrainians captured 8 villages on the Zaporizhia front. With this approach, the Wagner leader actually revealed his stance clearly. Actually, Prigozhin was doing the right thing because the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, was sending his own soldiers and the soldiers of his allies to their deaths without blinking an eye. You know that in addition to Dlimkinov, Major General Sergei Goryachev, one of the important commanders of the Russian army, was one of the soldiers who was targeted by the Ukrainian attacks in Zaporizhia. But Sergei Goryachev had less luck than Dlimkinov, because Goryachev, who was the target of the Ukrainian attacks, was killed in Zaporizhia. Prigozhin, on the other hand, does not want his mercenaries to suffer the fate of Goryachev. In the war that determined the fate of Eastern Europe with the warming of the weather, the direction of clashes began to shift from the Donbass region to southern Ukraine. At the center of the activity here are the regions where the Kherson and Dnipro rivers are located. Although Ukraine recaptured the region's capital, the city of Kherson, from Russian forces last November in one of the most important victories of the year-long war, the Russians are still trying to control territory in the wider Kherson province. Russian forces used positions on the east bank of the Dnipro River to bombard the city of Kherson on the opposite side of the waterway, preventing Kiev from regaining a sense of normalcy in the city. The Ukrainian armed forces, on the other hand, tried to disperse Russian troops with artillery attacks against Russian positions east of Dnipro. On the other hand, Russia tried to harden its defenses in the region, but these days there was no immediate sign that the bombardment of the city of Kherson was waning. Kherson, Governor Vladimir Saldo, appointed by Russia, said in a statement on Russian television that Moscow forces strengthened the defense line on the east side of the river. During the winter months, parts of the Kherson region spent weeks without access to electricity and water as Russian forces rained missiles, rockets, and drones on energy infrastructure targets to freeze the residents. But now, with the warming of the weather, the residents of the region have escaped from the cold a little bit. In addition, Ukrainian forces took action again in this area to clear the Russians as the Kherson front lines started to heat up. Striking news came from the region. Residents of the Kherson region reported new explosions near the Antonovsky Bridge. Although the Antonovsky Bridge was destroyed and it was impossible to cross from here to the left bank, it was learned that there were violent explosions in the area. The exact number of explosions that occurred here was not specified, but the flames from the explosions were visible from a great distance. Photos of the attacks on the Antonovsky Bridge were shared on social media. In the photos, you can clearly see the moment of one of the explosions. However, it is not possible to determine exactly whether the attack was carried out on the bridge itself or on the left bank. This attack on the bridge was a heavy blow against the Russian aim of creating a connecting corridor in Kherson. On the other hand, there was silence for a long time in and around the Antonovsky Bridge. The reasons for the attacks that broke the silence are still being investigated. In addition, on the same day as these attacks, there was a serious activity in the region between Crimea and Kherson. Video footage of a powerful explosion appeared in the city of Armyansk on the border of the Kherson region and the Crimea. Residents of Crimea shared the video of the explosion near Armyansk on social media. In the presented video frames, you can see that the column of smoke from the explosion rises to a height of tens of meters and some fragments are scattered to the sides. After this striking explosion, the sound of a second explosion was heard near the area. This time, the explosion occurred on the border of the Kherson district. The fact that the Crimea and Kherson regions have been targeted so frequently in recent days has brought a critical question to mind: are the Ukrainian forces now taking drastic steps to retake Crimea? On this subject, various Russian politicians have been discussing a possible attack on Russian positions on the Key Peninsula for the past few days. In this regard, Viktor Bondarev stated that Ukraine has neither the resources nor the military potential to retake Crimea. Russian lawmaker Andrei Gurulyev stressed that it would be a very wrong move for Moscow to ignore the possibility of a NATO-backed attack on Ukraine. Also, Russian lawmaker Mikhail Skirment warned that if Ukrainian troops launch a major attack on Crimea, they will suffer a final crushing blow once the jewel of the Russian Empire, the strategically important Black Sea Peninsula, has a long history, including resistance to the Nazis in World War II and, more recently, annexation by Vladimir Putin in 2014. Currently, Crimea has literally turned into a firing line. On the other hand, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February, President Vladimir Zelensky was cautious at first when he began to publicly voice his ambitions for the Crimea region. But as the war continued and Russian troops gained more and more victories on the front lines, the Ukrainians' aim became clearer. Crimea is Ukraine, and its armed forces will take it back. In this regard, Deputy Defense Minister of Ukraine Vladimir Kuralov stated that the Ukrainian forces could return to the Crimea in a short time and the whole war with Russia would end by spring. Kuralov did not specify an exact date, but added that the recapture of Crimea was only a matter of time. In order for the Ukrainians to recapture Crimea, they must first completely clear the Kherson region and the areas where they can form an attack ramp over the Dnipro River from the Russians. Especially the Kherson region is very important in terms of regaining Crimea. Ukrainian leader Zelensky is also aware of this situation. That's why leader Zelensky recently announced that he visited Ukraine's southern region of Kherson, visiting areas affected by Russia's full-scale invasion and its months-long campaign to destroy Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Zelensky's arrival in Kherson was his second visit to the front line in 2 days. Zelensky reported that he also visited Pozid-Pokrovska, an agricultural village that was largely destroyed during the fighting in the city of Kherson, about 20 miles away. Zelensky's travels to regions partly occupied by Russia came as Western allies increased supplies of arms and ammunition to Ukraine, which was preparing for an anticipated counter-offensive that could include pressure to retake captured territory. On the other hand, the Ukrainian leader stressed the importance of taking control of Kherson and also talked about the activities of the Ukrainian forces in Crimea. In fact, we all know that it is important to establish an attack zone in the Kherson region because the Ukrainian armed forces can easily target Crimea over Kherson with long-range missile systems such as the GLSDB. Then the Ukrainians can completely blockade the peninsula by carrying out airstrikes against the Crimea. With drones, it is very difficult for the Russians to respond in such a situation because although Russian air defense systems protect the Crimean Peninsula, Ukrainians have learned the location of Russian air defense systems thanks to the UAV attacks they have carried out on the peninsula. Ukrainian forces also know critical areas at Russian military bases in Crimea. In short, the only thing that the Ukrainians need is to create a solid attack area between the Kherson region and the Crimea and to support the attacks they can carry out from this area with drones. The fact that the Russians moved their air defense systems from southern Ukraine to Crimea in order to defend Crimea and not lose it to the Ukrainians is actually a strategic mistake. This is because it was much easier for the Ukrainians to fully control Kherson before the Crimea because with the relocation of Russian air defense systems to the peninsula, the active offensive actions of the Ukrainian Air Force and the Ukrainian Army's unmanned aerial vehicles in and around Kherson will be much more successful. The vulnerability of the region will bring the Ukrainians very close to the Crimean Peninsula. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is aware of the increasing danger of Ukraine around Crimea. For this reason, Russian attacks on Ukrainian military resources in and around Kherson began to increase. The Russian army continues to annoy the Ukrainians by forming small assault groups. It is predicted that this unrest in the triangle of Kherson, Dnipro and Crimea will continue for a long time. The reason for this is that the weather warms up and it will be much easier to carry out offensive actions in the coming days because both sides of the war had a hard time to organize an offensive operation during the cold winter months. Now the weather has warmed up and frontline clashes are heating up. Let's see what changes will happen in southern Ukraine in the coming days. We will see this together.